My brother slid the
Sign the
deed across the
deed,
table
Eliza.
like he was flicking scraps to a dog, and the whole room laughed with him.
Not yet,
You
Edwin.
always did like your useless drawings better than real property, Eliza, Edwin said. So keep this one. It suits you. That's how I learned what my father had left me. Not the 3 working farms, not the house with its ivy and its silver and its rooms I'd grown up in. Not one single profitable acre of the 2,000 he owned. A condemned lighthouse keeper's cottage on Blackthorn Head and £18, 12 shillings in unpaid rates that would force the parish to sell it out from under me in 3 weeks. Everybody at that table knew my father had taught me to survey. They'd just decided it didn't count for anything because I was his daughter and not his son. I waited until the carriages were gone. Then I laced my boots, took the brass compass my father had shown me how to read in secret when I was 13, and walked out to the one piece of England that was, as of that afternoon, entirely mine. The tide was low when I reached Blackthorn Head, and I did the thing I'd been trained to do before I'd even had time to feel sorry for myself. I checked the boundary. Not because I expected to find anything, because it was what you did with land, whether anyone thought you deserved to own it or not. 40 paces past where my deed said the property ended, I found a survey bolt driven into the rock. It had my father's initials struck into the brass. G.H. Below that, the year 1849. Below that, a small Roman numeral 3. According to the official Admiralty chart folded in my coat, that bolt should have been sitting under 12 feet of seawater. I crouched there a long time while the tide breathed in and out of the channels around me, turning that over. My father had planted this marker himself, 25 years before he died, in a spot the chart insisted didn't exist above the waterline. Either the Navy's own chart was wrong about a piece of English coastline which nobody was going to believe, least of all a magistrate, or the land under my boots had somehow moved 300 yards out to sea since it was surveyed. I took a bearing toward the old lighthouse tower, just to be sure my hands weren't the problem. Then I measured the angle from the tower to the spire of St. Aldwyn's, the way my father taught me before I was old enough to understand why he was teaching a girl at all. He used to call it a harmless amusement when I was small. Then my numbers started coming out steadier than his paid assistants, and the amusement turned into something else. Pre-dawn walks onto the cliffs while the household was told I was visiting an aunt who, as far as I know, never once asked after me. I drew his coastlines. I corrected his elevations. I copied his field notes by candlelight until my eyes burned. Every chart that went out under the name Harcourt carried his name alone. I ran the bearing again. The result didn't move. Somewhere between my father's private marker and the Admiralty's printed chart, the truth had gone missing, and I intended to find out where. That was when I noticed the stone around the bolt. A pale crescent scar cut into the rock on one side, where a chisel had bitten in and then stopped, like whoever was swinging it had lost his nerve or been interrupted. Someone had tried to take that marker out, recently, and hadn't finished the job. The water was already climbing over my boots by the time I let that sink in. I closed the compass, gathered my chain, and started back up toward the cottage, and from the cliff path, in full daylight, the place looked even worse than it had from the road that morning. Half the slate roof had caved into the loft. 2 windows were boarded over with gray, salt-eaten wood. The chimney leaned east like it was trying to walk away from the house. The front door hung crooked on hinges that had rusted through. Inside wasn't better. Gull feathers drifted across the floorboards. Rain had bled long brown stains down the plaster, and a whole corner of the ceiling had come down across the bed frame. A dead stove sat in the kitchen, surrounded by broken crockery, and a drift of blown sand that had probably been there since spring. I counted the coins in my purse twice, as if the number might change the second time. £7, 4 shillings. Against £18, 12 shillings owed. I could sell my watch. I could sell every instrument I owned except the compass, and I still wouldn't come close to closing that gap in 3 weeks. That was the exact moment I heard wheels grinding over stone coming up the track outside. Edwin walked in without knocking. He still had on the black coat from the will reading, though the hem was dark with mud now, like he'd come straight down the cliff path instead of by the road. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "It's mine. For another 21 days. I set the Admiralty chart on the table and put my glove down over the compass before he could get a look at it. "You followed me. I came to stop you doing something foolish." He looked around the ruined room, the collapsed ceiling, the sand on the floor, all of it with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sign it back to the estate. I'll clear the arrears myself and give you £20 on top." I almost laughed. 6 hours earlier, at that same table, he'd called Blackthorn Head worthless in front of the whole family. Now he was offering me more money than I'd had in my own name in years. Why would you pay for a ruin? Because father's name is attached to it. I don't want strangers picking through the place once the parish auctions it off. The estate could bid at the auction. Same as anyone. His eyes went, just for a second, to the measuring chain propped by the door. You've already been down on the shore. I kept my face still. I wanted to see where my land ended. It's printed on the deed. Maps have mistakes in them. Not father's maps. He said it too fast. I noticed that. Filed it away the way I'd file a bad reading not thrown out. Just marked as something to check again later. Edwin came closer and dropped his voice, like the walls might be listening. You have no profession, Eliza. No husband. No income. Pride isn't going to fix that roof. Take the money while I'm still offering it. And for one bad moment, I let myself see the life he was handing me. A rented room in some town where nobody had ever heard of Gideon Harcourt's daughter. My instruments sold off one at a time to pay for coal. Father's charts sitting in Edwin's library forever. Proof of a genius that had never entirely belonged to him in the first place. It would have been so easy to say yes. I folded the deed instead and put it inside my coat. No. Something moved in his jaw. Then don't come crying to the family when the parish takes it. He left, but he stopped outside the door long enough to look back down at the shore at exactly the spot where I'd found the marker. By then the tide had already swallowed it whole. Whatever he was looking for, the sea had beaten him to it. I waited until the sound of his carriage had died away behind the hill. Then I found a loose board, wedged it across the broken door, and carried what I had left into the one room that seemed likely to stay dry through the night. It didn't stay dry. Not really. But before the worst of it started, I opened a new field book, the kind I used to fill for my father and never once got to sign, and wrote the date across the first blank page. Blackthorn Head. Independent survey. Underneath I recorded the bearing, the distance, and the inscription on the marker exactly as I'd found it. Marker 3 stands in open air where every official chart shows deep water. I looked at that sentence for a long time in the lamplight. If there was a marker numbered 3, cut into brass by my father's own hand, then somewhere under 25 years of tide and silence there had to be a marker 1 and a marker 2 as well. By the time the sky went gray with morning, I'd counted 6 separate places where the rain had found its way through my new roof. I moved the bed frame under the one beam that still looked honest, and set cracked bowls under the worst of the leaks. There was no dry firewood anywhere in the place, so I ate the last of the bread from my travel bag and looked hard at the building instead, the way I'd have looked at a survey that wasn't adding up. The west wall was sound. The chimney could be saved if the top courses came off before the next real gale. Most of the south roof would need replacing outright, but the small back room could be made weather-tight with timber, nails, and tarred canvas, if I could find someone to sell me those things on credit. I wrote each repair down with a price beside it. My cheapest honest estimate still came to more than £5. Penmarrow was 2 miles inland, a steep little market street that ran down to a harbor crowded with pilchard barrels and drying nets. I walked in with the compass hidden under my coat and my father's chain over one shoulder, and I felt every conversation on that street go quiet as I passed. There was already a notice nailed up outside the parish office with my name on it. Property to be sold for unpaid rates. 20 days, it said. Not 21. Somebody had started the clock a day early. The clerk inside sat behind an iron rail, a narrow man with silver spectacles and ink permanently worked into his fingertips. Mr. Curnow, the sign on his desk, said, "I can pay £7 today," I told him. "Will the parish hold the sale while I raise the rest?" "The full amount is required, Miss Harcourt." £18.12, plus the cost of the auction itself. That notice went up quickly. "Your brother informed us you intended to abandon the property. He informed you before he asked me." Curnow straightened his papers instead of answering that. Through the window behind him, I watched 3 fishermen reading the notice out loud to each other and laughing at something one of them said. "Who does roof work around here?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough that I knew the answer mattered. "Caleb Rowe. Yards behind the Coopers." Caleb looked over my sketch of the cottage without inviting me past his own doorway. Big through the shoulders, lime dust worked so deep into his knuckles it looked like part of his skin. £14 for the roof, he said. 3 more for the chimney. I only need the one room made safe. £10 then. You carry the slate yourself. I can give you 2 now and the rest after I've done a survey. Something shut behind his eyes. What survey? Blackthorn Head. He pushed the sketch back at me like it had gone cold in his hands. I don't work that ground. Not for any money. Why not? My father trusted a Harcourt chart. His boat went onto the western reef in clear weather, calm sea, broad daylight practically. 3 men drowned that morning who had no business drowning. I knew the wreck. Everyone in that part of the county did. My father had told the inquiry the channel must have shifted without warning. The chart he trusted may not have carried my father's actual measurements, I said. That doesn't bring the men home. No, I said. It doesn't. He studied me a moment, maybe surprised I hadn't jumped to defend him. Then he tipped his chin toward the chandlery down the hill. They sell old sailcloth there. Patch your small room before the wind picks up. And don't go up on that roof alone. It was the closest thing to kindness anyone in Penmarrow had offered me all day. Ruth Lanyon ran the chandlery, iron-gray hair, a voice that had spent 30 years shouting over harbor wind and never quite come back down to a normal volume. She charged me 8 shillings for canvas, nails, lamp oil, and a coil of rope, and while she was tying the bundle she caught sight of the compass under my coat. Gideon's. Mine now. He carried a different one before that. I went still. You knew my father? Everyone here knew your father. She finished the knot. Did he ever survey Blackthorn Head? Back in 49? I don't know yet. Ask the cottage, she said. It's kept more of his secrets than this village ever did. She turned to another customer before I could ask what that meant. By the time I got back up the cliff path, the afternoon was going gray again and the tide had already covered my father's marker for the day. I lashed the canvas over the small room from the inside, careful not to put my weight on the roof itself, and by dusk I had one space in the whole cottage where the rain couldn't reach me. Then I started measuring the walls. The building was 29 feet north to south on the outside, 27 feet 10 inches on the inside. That gap was nothing. Stone walls that thick would eat exactly that much space, and I almost stopped there and told myself the numbers matched. Except the east measurement didn't. More than 2 feet had gone missing between the outer wall and the room I was standing in, and no wall in England was 2 feet thick for no reason. I tapped the plaster, listening for a hollow space behind it. Every section rang the same, solid all the way through. I checked the chimney breast, the floor level, the angle where the foundation met the cliff. Nothing accounted for it. That was when my lamp threw a narrow line of light across the sill of the north window, and I saw 3 shallow cuts in the stone. 2 straight, 2 even, to be weather damage. I scraped the dirt out of them with my thumbnail, and found a small brass pin set dead center in the middle groove. I laid my compass over it without quite letting myself believe what I already suspected. The first groove lined up on St. Aldwyn's spire, the second pointed straight at the old lighthouse tower, the third faced the exact stretch of water where marker 3 sat waiting for the next low tide. This cottage hadn't just housed a lighthouse keeper. Somebody had built it as a fixed surveying station, a place from which you could take 3 permanent bearings without ever setting up a tripod. Under the flaking paint beneath the sill, half hidden, someone had scratched a distance into the stone itself. 1,742 yards. Underneath the number, 2 initials. M.H. I put my finger against them and didn't move for a long time. Those were my mother's initials. Marianne Harcourt, the woman I'd been told my whole life, knew absolutely nothing about maps. I spent the whole next morning searching for another mark she might have left. I didn't find one. Those 2 letters under the windowsill were the only proof I had that my mother had ever set foot in that surveying station, and I copied their exact shape into my field book before I let myself think about anything else. The 3 grooves had been cut to different depths. I noticed shallow, medium, deep, like they were meant to be read in a particular order. Church, lighthouse, marker 3, and the distance scratched into the stone, 1,742 yards, was too short to reach the church from where I stood. It had to connect the lighthouse to something out past the reef instead. At noon I carried my instruments down to the shore, planted my staff above the waterline, and took bearings from the cottage window and the church spire both. My first pass through the numbers came out wrong. I'd started the tide clock 10 minutes early, a stupid mistake, the kind of thing that would have gotten me sent back to redo the whole page if my father had caught it, and I made myself walk the baseline again from the start rather than trust a figure I didn't believe. That was when a voice came down from the path. Looking for another mistake? Caleb Rowe stood with his arms crossed, a leather tool bag over one shoulder. I'm looking for the reef that sank your father's boat. His face went hard. You talk about it easy enough. No, I talk about it exactly. I showed him the Admiralty chart. A cross marked the position the inquiry had recorded for the wreck. The report puts your father here, I said. But from that spot, St. Aldwyn's spire would sit east of the lighthouse. His own statement to the inquiry says it was west. You've read his statement? My father kept a copy. Of course he did. Caleb turned to go. The inquiry used the wrong position, I said. Give me 1 hour. If I can't prove it, you never have to speak to me again. He stayed. I stretched the chain between two fixed rocks and worked out a fresh baseline while he watched every move I made, close enough that I could feel him doing it. When the tide dropped another foot, I walked west and stopped over a patch of water that looked, to any eye but a surveyor's, like nothing at all. The reef should be here, I said. According to your father's chart. According to the chart with his name printed on it. Not necessarily according to him. He looked at me sharp when I said that. A few minutes later, a dark ridge broke the surface as the tide kept falling, water pouring off its crown in sheets. It stood nearly 200 yards west of where the published chart put it. Caleb came down over the wet rock and laid his hand flat against the stone. My father said the light led him too far west that night, he said. Everyone told him afterward he'd mistaken some other boat's lantern. Was the lighthouse even lit that night? It had been dark 6 years. I looked back up at the tower, no glass left in the lantern room, nothing but an empty shell, and yet it still dominated the whole headland from where we stood. If your father saw a light out here, I said, somebody put it there on purpose. Can you prove that? Not yet. He was watching my face for the kind of certainty my father always had at every inquiry, every hearing, every dinner table. I didn't give it to him. I can prove the published position of the reef is wrong, I said. Anything past that is a guess, and I'm not in the business of selling guesses. That answer seemed to land somewhere he hadn't expected. He came back the next morning with a handcart of salvaged slate, sound timber, and a short ladder. I'll make the north room safe, he said. £2 now. The rest can wait till the auction's settled, one way or another. You wouldn't take my credit yesterday. Yesterday I thought you were defending bad charts because your father made them. And today? Today I think you hate them worse than I do. We worked until our hands went stiff with cold. I hauled slate while he replaced the rotten battens, and he showed me how to test each piece before we set it, tapping it with a knuckle and listening for the crack that meant it wouldn't hold. We mixed lime mortar together for the chimney. I packed the window frame with oakum while he cut the leaning top courses down to something the wind couldn't get hold of. By evening, the north room was dry for the first time in years. I scraped the rust out of the old stove and found the flue still sound below the roofline, and Caleb shortened the chimney instead of rebuilding the whole thing, which saved us both time and stone we didn't have. When the first small fire caught, actual warmth moved through that cottage, and for a minute neither of us said anything at all. He stood in the doorway afterward, gathering his tools. I found something after my father died, he said. Among his things. My mother wanted it burned. What was it? A pilot's notebook. Bearings, tide times, names of vessels. None of the figures ever meant a thing to me. Do you still have it? Ruth does. I remembered then that Caleb's father and Ruth's late husband had crewed together for years. Would she let me see it? That depends, Caleb said, on what she thinks you mean to do with the truth once you've got it. A knock came after dark. Ruth stood outside with a narrow book wrapped in oilcloth, and she didn't step in when I opened the door. Caleb told me where you found the reef, she said. Come in, please. She stayed on the threshold. My husband kept this hidden 23 years. Edwin came into the chandlery yesterday asking whether I still had it. I looked at the wrapped book in her hands. Why would Edwin even know it exists? He heard your mother speak of it once. A long time ago. She put it in my hands, but didn't let go right away. Marianne drew every bearing in those pages, she said. Your father published them under his own name. Then she turned and walked back down into the dark before I could ask her anything else. I sat by the fire and unwrapped it. The early pages held careful columns of tides and coastal angles, and the handwriting wasn't my father's smaller, faster, more sure of itself. On the last page, my mother had sketched 3 numbered boundary markers, and beside the first one she'd written a single line. Begin where the coastline disappears. It meant nothing to me until I laid her notebook straight over the official chart. Every bearing in her book ran slightly west of the printed version, the same small error, 2 degrees and 40 minutes, repeated across 9 separate readings. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. Nobody makes the same mistake 9 times in a row unless somebody's making them make it. Someone had shifted every line on that chart by the exact same amount on purpose and left the shift small enough that no one would ever think to check it. I weighted the pages down with slate and followed my mother's corrected bearings across the printed coastline. 3 of them ran straight under the decorative panel that held the chart's title, the little scrollwork border every published chart has, the part nobody ever looks at twice. The engraved coastline stopped on one side of that panel and picked back up on the other, and the whole stretch of Blackthorn Head in between had been hidden under ornamental ink. There the coastline disappeared. The distance from the lighthouse to that hidden section came out to exactly 1,742 yards. I didn't sleep much that night. At first light I carried the notebook down to Ruth's shop. Why did she take those readings? I asked her. Ruth kept working, measuring rope, not looking up, because Gideon needed her to. Did she go out with him? On the surveys? Your mother could take a bearing off a moving boat faster than your father could get his own tripod set up on dry land. I'd been 8 when Marianne died. What I remembered was soft gloves, the smell of lavender water, long afternoons behind a closed bedroom door. My father had always said illness had made her weak. He told me she knew nothing about maps. He told a great many people that. Then why did she let him publish it as his own? Ruth's knife stopped against the rope. A married woman with no professional standing has very few places to put her name, Eliza. Your father kept promising the next survey would carry hers. There was always a next survey. There was. She cut the rope clean through. Don't mistake her silence for her consent. 3 fishermen were waiting outside when I left, a torn copy of my father's chart in one man's hand. Caleb had told them where the western reef really sat, and the pilchard boats were due in before autumn. We're not asking for official, one of them said. Before I could even explain, I had no authority to issue one. We're asking for accurate. 12 shillings, for a working sheet marking the reef, the depths, and a safe bearing off the church spire. It was the first time in my life anyone had paid me for work carrying my own name, and I spent the whole afternoon on the harbor wall taking soundings to make sure I earned it. Ruth lent me her husband's old line. Caleb rowed out to check 3 positions past the breakwater, and every depth I found matched my mother's old figures within half a fathom. There was a letter waiting under my door when I got back. Edwin's solicitor, demanding I surrender every Harcourt family paper in my possession, threatening an injunction and costs against what little I still had coming from the estate. The will had left me the cottage and its contents. It said nothing at all about papers brought there after my father died. Edwin might not know exactly what Ruth had handed me, but he knew enough to be frightened of it, and that told me more than the letter itself did. I wrapped my mother's notebook back in fresh oilcloth and carried it inside my coat from then on. 2 nights later, the low tide I needed finally came before dawn. Caleb met me on the shore with a lantern, a crowbar, and rope, and neither of us said much walking out. You should have told me Edwin was threatening you with lawyers, he said eventually. Ruth told you. Ruth tells me whatever she decides I ought to know. We followed the cliff base west, and I counted chain lengths from the lighthouse until we hit the exact distance cut into the stone under my window. There was nothing there but a fall of loose stone and brown weed hanging across a narrow pool, nothing that looked like a boundary of anything. I climbed onto a flat rock and took a bearing toward the church spire, then shifted 11 feet north. Here, I said. Caleb brought the lantern down low. Under the weed, the edge of a dressed granite slab showed through the sand. We cleared it together and found a brass disc set flat into the stone, a numeral I, engraved dead center. Under it, my mother's initials. Caleb knelt beside it. This isn't a natural shelf. No, I said. It's a threshold. We pulled the loose stones away together and found the upper curve of a granite arch behind them, carefully built and later blocked up with rubble on purpose. A rusted mooring ring sat fixed beside it. Whatever had once passed through that opening had been wide enough for a small boat. The tide was already starting to fill the pool. Caleb tested one of the blocking stones with his crowbar. These were set from the land side. Somebody wanted this shut, and wanted it shut from up above, not from the water. Can we clear it? Not before the sea has us, and not without checking the cliff above first. If that arch has weakened, pulling it open could bring half the slope down with it. I copied the marker's inscription and measured its angle before we lost the light. A shallow line was cut across the brass disc, pointing inland, straight through the blocked arch. Marker, I wasn't the outer edge of anything. It was the beginning of something buried underneath it. We climbed back up ahead of the water. From the upper path I saw fresh red stakes driven into the ground all around the cottage, a whole line of them, marching right up to my own front door. A man in a brown coat was measuring the cliff face while two laborers hammered another stake in near the lighthouse. Kukupani. Caleb swore under his breath. They've been sniffing around about quarrying rights for months. The land hasn't been sold to anyone. Try telling Edwin that. I walked over to the nearest stake. A proposed haul road had been marked straight across my own yard, running right over the buried surveying line under my window, as if whoever drew it knew exactly what they were driving through. Carrick wasn't waiting on the parish auction. And that meant only one thing. Edwin had already promised them Blackthorn Head. I pulled the stake out of the ground. The man in the brown coat stopped mid-measurement. "Put that back, Miss Harcourt. You know my name. Lewis Dane. Surveyor for Carrick Granite. Mr. Edwin Harcourt warned us you might make trouble. This is my property." Dane unfolded a document with Edwin's signature at the bottom. It granted the company leave to assess mineral value and lay a road from the cliff down to the harbor, and it described Edwin as owner of the foreshore, the lighthouse, and every acre west of the old Harcourt boundary. The cottage appeared on the plan as a small excluded rectangle like an afterthought. "You've measured off the published chart," I said. "We've measured off the estate plan. They repeat the same mistake." He smiled the kind of smile men give women right before they stop listening to them. "A woman living under sailcloth has found an error every surveyor in the county missed. One surveyor placed a boundary marker exactly where your plan shows open water. I'd call that more than an error." The smile went away. "We come back in 3 days with authority from the magistrate," Dane said. "Anything still in our way after that gets removed at your expense." They took their instruments and left the stakes behind. I pulled every one of them out of the ground and stacked them against the cottage wall. "They already know the stone's worth something," Caleb said. "Do you know? Granite runs through the north cliff. Most of it's too shot through with cracks to cut for profit, but there might be sound stone under the lighthouse itself." I looked again at the haul road on Edwin's plan. It crossed, almost exactly, the line running from marker first through my own north window. "He's selling land he doesn't have title to. He believes he has it." "No," I said. "If he believed that, he wouldn't need my mother's notebook." We went back inside, and I opened my field book to the first measurements I'd taken my very first night in that house. "The east wall is still missing more than 2 feet, I said. Caleb rapped his knuckles along the plaster again. "Solid all the way. So was the arch on the shore. Before we cleared it. Marker I points inland. From its threshold I've checked the bearing twice. Follow that line, and it runs straight through this room." I stretched a length of cord from the brass pin in the window across the floor. It ended right beside the old stove. Caleb pulled the stoveplate off and found an iron flue running up into the wall, exactly where it should be, but behind it, half hidden, a second iron sleeve ran horizontal instead of up. "That never carried smoke a day in its life," he said. I put the lamp close to it. A narrow metal rod ran back into the dark, farther than the light reached. Caleb gripped it with his pliers. It didn't want to move at first. Then the rust cracked loose all at once and the rod slid forward several inches. Something let go, deep inside the wall. A seam opened up in the plaster, a straight vertical line where there shouldn't have been one. We scraped the outer layer away and found an oak door fitted flush into the stone, its iron hinges mounted on the far side so you'd never see them from the room. When Caleb pulled the rod a second time, the door swung open toward us. Cold air came out of the wall like the house had been holding its breath. 6 narrow steps led down into the dark. "Stones sound," Caleb said, testing the first one with his weight. "Stay behind me." The stair ended in a chamber cut into the cliff itself, scarcely 10 feet across, its arched ceiling dry as bone. A ventilation pipe ran up through exactly the gap in the wall I'd never been able to explain. That was the missing 2 feet. It had never been a mistake in the masonry. It had been a room. Brass scales were mounted along one wall. A chain ran down through a sealed hole in the floor, likely tied to a tide gauge somewhere near the blocked sea arch. A drafting table stood under a hooded lamp reflector, and wooden racks lined the driest wall, numbered from top to bottom. Almost all of them were empty. Caleb touched a pale rectangle in the dust where something had clearly sat for years and didn't anymore. "Something's been taken out of here." "Several things. Sheets 1, 2, and 4 through 9 all bare. Only sheet 3 remained, its wooden frame swollen so badly it had jammed itself into the rack and refused to come out with everything else. We worked it loose together. Inside lay a copper engraving plate, dark with age, wrapped in waxed cloth that had kept the damp off it for who knows how long. The design ran backward, the way every printing plate does. I cleaned one corner with my sleeve and made out the reversed letters. Marianne Harcourt, delineator. I couldn't speak for a second. My mother's name, cut directly into the copper itself. Whoever had stripped her name off the printed chart had done it during the printing, not before, not after. Somebody had taken a plate that said her name and made sure the world never saw it. I spread a sheet of paper over the copper and rubbed it gently with a stick of charcoal until a coastline came up out of the dark. It showed the western reef. It showed marker 1. It showed a narrow tidal passage running in under the headland that didn't appear on any chart I'd ever seen. Past that passage, the drawing simply stopped at the plate's edge. Whatever came next had been engraved on sheet 4, one of the ones that was missing. Caleb crouched beside 3 small crosses, marked inside the tidal passage. Graves? Sounding stations, maybe. Or fixed structures. I honestly didn't know yet, and I wasn't going to pretend I did. Near the bottom edge, a dotted line enclosed the lighthouse, the cottage, the foreshore, and part of the north cliff. 3 unfamiliar initials sat inside it. B. M. T. Under them, a date, engraved deep enough to survive 25 years underground. 1816. That's before your mother was even born, Caleb said. She was copying an older boundary. Somebody else's. Whose? Neither of us had an answer. There was no deed down there, no register, nothing that could tell us who BMT was or what they'd owned. Just empty racks where the rest of the proof used to be. That was when something crashed in the cottage directly above us. Caleb killed the lamp. Footsteps crossed the room over our heads. A drawer scraped open. Someone shoved the drafting table hard enough to hear it drag across the floor. Someone was looking for my mother's notebook. I pressed the copper plate flat against my chest and stood still against the chamber wall. Through the narrowing gap of the closing door, I heard Edwin's voice, low and irritated. She's taken the notebook elsewhere. Then the cottage holds nothing we need, Lewis Dane answered. You were hired to measure stone, Mr. Dane. Leave the papers to me. Floorboards creak directly above the hidden stair. The northern bench gets tested tomorrow. If the granite's sound, Carrick releases the first payment. And if it isn't, it's sound. It has to be. My arrangement with your company depends on that money. I heard the outer door close behind them a minute later. Caleb waited another full minute before he pushed the panel open. The room had been torn apart. My papers were scattered across the floor. One of my crates had been split open with something heavy, and the parish auction notice lay on the drafting table with 16 written across it in Edwin's hand, where the printed number had said 20. He was moving the clock again. He means to use Carrick's money to buy this place out from under you, Caleb said. Then we move the plate tonight, before he thinks to come back for it. We wrapped it in the leftover roof canvas. I kept my mother's notebook against my skin, under my dress, where nobody would find it without finding me first. Everything else in that cottage could be replaced. That plate and that notebook could not. Before sunrise, I worked out where Carrick's test site had to sit, and the number scared me. The northern bench stood directly over the old sea arch. A powder charge set there, even a small one, could tear straight through the roof of the chamber underneath it. We found 4 laborers already at the rock face when we arrived, drilling by hand, Lewis Dane overseeing them while Edwin watched from a safe distance up the path. You cannot blast here, I said. Dane didn't even turn around. We have the landowner's authority. You have a disputed map and no idea what's underneath you. We sounded the bench yesterday. With a hammer on the surface, there's a built passage directly below it. Edwin stepped forward. My sister has spent too many nights alone out here, inventing rooms that don't exist. I can show you the entrance right now. Caleb's eyes cut toward me, showing them the chamber meant giving up the one advantage we had left. But a young laborer was already packing black powder into the drilled hole, and I wasn't about to let pride cost a man his life. Dane ordered him to continue anyway. What's your name? I asked the laborer. He glanced at Dane before he answered. Matthew Searle. Matthew. The rock under your feet may be hollow. Dane told him again to finish the charge. Caleb pulled me back behind a stone ridge. The laborers lit the fuse and scrambled to join us, and a muffled crack rolled through the cliff, dust rising, a sharper crack of splitting granite following right behind it. For 1 second, nothing else happened. Then the ground under Matthew simply opened. He went down through a curtain of falling stone, and his shout cut off hard against something below. Caleb reached the hole first. He's alive. 10 feet down, Matthew lay pinned under a broken timber, one of the old passage beams, with water already seeping in through fresh cracks near his legs. The tide's coming in, I said. That passage runs straight to the sea arch. Dane started shouting for ropes. Digging from up here brings more stone down on him, Caleb said. The chamber entrance is inside my cottage. I looked straight at Edwin when I said it. We go in from below, or we lose him. Edwin's eyes went narrow. You told me there was no room. I told you your men would be standing directly over one. I didn't wait for his answer. I ran. We went down through the hidden stair with rope and a crowbar. Caleb first, then Dane, then Edwin last of all. Matthew had come through the chamber's own ceiling, the timber pinning his coat and one leg while water spread across the floor from the broken tide gauge shaft. I got down beside him. Can you move your foot? Can't feel it. The timbers caught your coat, not your leg. I think your leg's still free. Caleb wedged the crowbar under the beam. Dane took the other end without being asked. When we lift, pull him toward the stair, I told them. The first try raised it less than an inch. Water reached his hip. We tried again, harder. I cut through the heavy wool of his coat with my knife and dragged him backward as the beam came up and his boot caught fast between two stones. Leave it, Matthew gasped. Leave the boot. I pulled the laces loose and freed his foot just as Caleb let the crowbar go, and the beam crashed down into the water where his leg had been a second earlier. We carried him up and laid him by the stove. His ankle had swollen badly, but he could still move his toes, and Caleb wrapped it tight while somebody ran for the doctor. That was when I noticed Edwin had never come back up with the rest of us. I found him still down in the chamber, standing over the copper plate, the canvas torn away in the scramble, my mother's reversed coastline shining up under his lamp. I put myself between him and it. A man nearly drowned because you wouldn't listen to me. He wasn't even looking at Matthew. His eyes were fixed on the dotted boundary and the three initials inside it. BMT, he said very quietly. You know what that means. I know Father spent 20 years making sure no one ever found it. He looked at me then in a way he never had before. Not the amusement from the will reading. Something closer to recognition. Blackthorn Mariners Trust, he said. A dead charity. No trustees left. No property left to speak of. Then why did he cut its charts to pieces? He was correcting an old confusion. By erasing our mother's name from her own work? He reached past me for the plate. Caleb caught his wrist before he got there. You've already put one man in the ground today, Caleb said. Don't make it worse. Louis Dane appeared at the top of the stair, his coat soaked through from helping carry Matthew to the cart. The blast is being reported to Carrick. Work stops until the structure's been examined properly. Your company caused the collapse, Edwin snapped. After Miss Harcourt warned us there was something down here. That one landed. Edwin had nothing to say back to it. I wrapped the plate again myself. Blackthorn Head is mine until a court proves otherwise. You can't afford a court. No, I said. That's exactly what you've been counting on. He left without another word. By noon the next day, a parish officer arrived with Curnow and 2 constables. Dane's own report described damage to the chamber ceiling, a fractured tide gauge shaft, possible instability under the whole cottage. They nailed a red notice to my door. Unfit for habitation. Entry prohibited pending inspection. I read it while rain blew sideways across the yard. Carrick caused that damage, I said. The cause doesn't change the danger, Miss Harcourt, Curnow said. I can live in the north room without ever going near the chamber. The chamber sits under the foundations. The whole structure is compromised. Who asked for this order? He wouldn't meet my eyes. Mr. Edwin Harcourt presented Carrick's report to the magistrate himself. The constables gave me an hour to gather clothing, instruments, and papers. Caleb helped me search the whole cottage twice over. The copper plate was gone. We tore through every crate. We looked under the bed frame. Caleb got 2 steps down the hidden stair before a constable ordered him back up. Edwin took it, I said. Did you see him take it? Curnow asked. He was standing over it yesterday. That isn't proof of theft. I still had my mother's notebook and the charcoal rubbing I'd pulled from the plate myself. It would have to be enough, because the original, the actual copper, with my mother's name cut into metal that couldn't lie the way a person could, was gone. I packed the rubbing inside my field book and let Caleb load the handcart. The repaired window, the shortened chimney, the patched roof, all of it stayed behind, sealed off with red paper and a magistrate's signature. The auction notice still read 16 days. Ruth gave me the small room above her chandlery that night. Matthew's mother came by with eggs and bread before I'd even finished unpacking. "Doctor says it's a bad sprain, not a break," she told me. "He'll walk fine." "I'm glad. He's telling everyone in Penmarrow you warned them before that charge went off." She set the basket down. "Carrick let Mr. Dane go for signing a statement that backed your account. He's gone to his sister's in Truro, but he left a copy with Caleb before he went. Edwin could still call me reckless in front of the whole family. He could no longer say it without somebody in that room knowing it wasn't true." After she left, Ruth closed the shutters and sat across from me. "What do you actually know about the Blackthorn Mariners' Trust?" I asked her. "Only stories," she said. "It was set up after 3 winter wrecks left more than 20 families with nothing coming in. Sailors' widows pooled what they had to keep the warning lights burning and the local charts honest. What happened to it? The refuge harbor was said to have collapsed. The lighthouse passed to the Harcourt estate after that, and people were told the trust had spent its last shilling. In 1816? Around then, yes. That copper plate showed trust land running under the North Cliff, the same cliff Carrick wants to quarry." Her face went tight. "Granite was found under there years afterward. If the trust had held the mineral rights all along, the Harcourt estate had been collecting income for decades that was never legally theirs. Edwin's desperation suddenly had a number attached to it. I laid the charcoal rubbing on the table between us. The reversed letters showed as dark, broken shapes, and I'd read enough engraving plates backward in my life to make sense of most of it, but along the margins, my mother had added notes in a script so small it was almost impossible to read even right side up. Ruth brought a looking glass from her room. Held up to it, the coastline flipped into its proper orientation, and the broken title finally resolved into words. Blackthorn Mariners Trust Western Survey. Below that, 3 boundary markers, positioned exactly where Caleb and I had found them. And along the bottom edge, a line of lettering I'd missed entirely the first time, half buried under charcoal dust. I copied each reversed letter into my field book until the sentence finally came clear. "Witness copy of conveyance deposited in the vestry chest of St. Aldwyn's, March 1816. Ruth stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "That chest hasn't been opened in years. Curnow holds the parish keys. And Edwin holds Curnow. The cottage was sealed. The original plate was gone. The sale was 16 days away. But Edwin had taken the wrong piece of evidence, the metal, not the words engraved along its edge, and the one document that could prove who truly owned Blackthorn Head had never been hidden in that cottage at all. At 9 the next morning, I walked into the parish office with Ruth and Caleb on either side of me and laid my copy of that inscription flat on Curnow's desk. "I'm requesting access to the St. Aldwyn's vestry chest." He read it and pushed it straight back. "That chest holds parish records, not private property. The parish is about to sell Blackthorn Head for unpaid rates. This conveyance may prove part of that land was never taxable, and never Edwin's to sell. You have a charcoal rubbing. Nothing more." Ruth folded her arms. "Then open the chest in front of witnesses, Mr. Curnow, or explain to every fishing family in this village exactly why you wouldn't." By noon he'd gotten the second key from the rector. The chest itself sat under the stair at St. Aldwyn's, bound in iron straps, secured with 2 separate locks that hadn't been touched in a generation. Curnow opened it with the rector, Ruth, Caleb, and me all standing over his shoulder. Inside were marriage registers, tithe agreements, charity accounts, brittle bundles of old correspondence, and an index, listing exactly 3 letters against the year 1816, B.M.T. It pointed us to a packet filed under benevolent marine subscriptions, tucked in among ordinary widows' relief donations instead of property records, as if someone long ago had wanted it misfiled on purpose. The seal on it had never been broken. Inside lay a parchment deed, a hand-colored boundary plan, and a sworn statement written 36 years after the deed itself. I opened the deed first. In March of 1816, after 3 fatal wrecks in a single winter, my great-grandfather had conveyed the lighthouse, the keeper's cottage, the western foreshore, the refuge basin, and the northern granite seam to the Blackthorn Mariners' Trust to keep warning lights burning, fund honest local surveys, shelter boats in dangerous tides, and support the families of men lost at sea. The trust could lease the stone, but every shilling of royalty had to go back into that purpose. The land could never revert to the Harcourt estate simply because its trustees died off or its work slowed down. New trustees were to be named jointly by the parish and any surviving subscribers. Edwin had never had the right to sell that granite. My father had never actually owned the cottage he left me in his will. Then I reached the line describing the residence as the permanent home and office of the trust's appointed cartographer, and I had to read it twice before it landed. My inheritance was legally broken in every way Edwin could exploit. And it had also been built, from the very beginning, for someone with exactly my training. Caleb unfolded the boundary plan beside me. The line began at marker the 1st by the sea arch, crossed a baseline at the church, and ended at marker 3 past the coastline the modern charts had erased. Every position matched what we'd already measured ourselves, stone for stone. We still haven't found marker 2, Curnow said. The deed described it as a brass datum set into the south foundation of St. Aldwyn's itself. We carried the plan outside and found it within the hour, under a rainwater trough, moss scraped away to show a square brass plate with a numeral 2 and the trust's full name. 3 markers now, standing up out of the ground to answer for themselves. Back inside, I opened the sworn statement last, because some part of me already knew what it would say and wasn't ready for it yet. My mother had written it in 1852, 1 year after the wreck that killed Caleb's father. She stated that she had surveyed the western reef herself, that she had copied the trust's original boundary from records that existed nowhere else, that she had prepared 9 copper plates for a corrected coastal chart, and that before the printing, my grandfather had ordered the trust name struck out and the western bearings shifted because the estate was negotiating a granite lease it couldn't get while the old 1816 conveyance still stood in the way. My father had obeyed him. My mother had not. In secret, she'd restored the true lines to her own master plates and deposited a witness copy of the deed with the parish herself, meaning to bring it before the wreck inquiry. But illness had confined her before she ever got the chance, and my father submitted the altered chart without her statement attached to it at all. I read the last lines twice. My daughter has inherited my aptitude for measurement. I pray she will also inherit the freedom to place her own name upon her work. The rector turned away to give me a moment I badly needed. My mother hadn't spent her last years behind that closed bedroom door because illness had made her weak. She had spent them protecting a charity built for drowned men's widows, while the men around her quietly erased both the land and her name from the record of it. I finally understood the refuge basin and the blocked arch above it. The chain in the chamber, tied to a tide gauge, no one had checked in decades. The sighting grooves under my window, lined up on every marker that mattered. Even the reef that had supposedly shifted turned out to have never moved an inch. Only the printed chart had moved it, on purpose, one small shift at a time. Curnow examined the deed seal against the parish index, comparing them for a long, careful minute. "This appears to be valid," he said. "The auction cannot proceed until a magistrate settles the boundary and new trustees are appointed." A voice answered from the church doorway. "You've found the document that created the trust," Edwin said. "That proves nothing about whether it still existed when Father acquired the land." He walked in carrying a leather case. Our younger brother Julian followed a few steps behind him, pale, saying nothing. Edwin drew out a second parchment. "This dissolution was executed in 1848, he said. "It returned every acre to the Harcourt estate, lawfully, 32 years ago." I looked at the plan attached to it. The coastline matched the same altered chart I'd already spent 2 weeks disproving, piece by piece. Marker 3 sat drawn in deep water, exactly where it had never actually been. He'd brought the one document that could have beaten us. He'd also, without realizing it, brought me the exact same impossible map I'd already taken apart with my own 2 hands. The hearing was held 3 days later in the St. Aldwyn's Parish Hall, and by the time it started, there wasn't a free bench left. Fishermen packed the back rows. Matthew Searle sat near the front on crutches, his foot still wrapped in linen. Lewis Dane had come all the way back from Truro to give evidence about the blast and about the arrangement Edwin had made with Carrick behind the estate's back. A county magistrate sat at the front table with the rector and Mr. Curnow. Between them lay the original 1816 deed, my mother's sworn statement, Edwin's so-called dissolution, and every survey record I'd kept since the day I first found marker 3. Edwin wore a new black coat. Julian sat a few feet behind him, staring at his own hands. The magistrate opened the dissolution first. "This is dated February 1848. Mr. Harcourt, where was it kept?" "In my father's map room," Then why was it never entered in the parish index? My grandfather considered the trust a private family matter. A charitable conveyance that names parish appointees is not a private family matter, Mr. Harcourt. Edwin's eyes found me across the room. My sister has encouraged this confusion because she wants to keep property she has no means of maintaining. The magistrate turned to me. You dispute this dissolution, Miss Harcourt? I do. On what grounds? I laid the boundary plan attached to Edwin's document beside the original 1816 map and opened my field book to the page I'd been waiting 3 days to read aloud. This dissolution describes a line running from marker 2 at the church to marker 3 on the western ledge, witnessed in February of 1848. I pointed to my own drawing of the brass bolt. Marker 3 carries my father's initials and the year 1849. It did not exist yet when this document claims to have been signed against it. Edwin was on his feet. Markers get replaced. That date could record a repair. The original trust map calls that same point Old Beacon Rock. My mother's sworn statement records that my father installed a new brass marker there during his 1849 reserve. The inscription doesn't mark a repair. It marks the day the marker was made. I handed the statement to the magistrate. There's a second problem with the coastline on this plan, I went on. It shows marker 3 standing under 12 feet of water. Caleb Rowe watched me stand on dry rock beside it at low tide. My own bearings off the church tower and the lighthouse confirm exactly where it sits. Dane stood without being asked. Carrick's own survey reached the same result after the accident. The Harcourt estate plan shifts every western bearing by 2 degrees in 40 minutes. Edwin's composure was starting to come apart at the seams. A technical error in a map doesn't undo a signed deed. No, I said. But a dead man's signature might. Curnow opened the parish burial register on the table in front of him. One of the 2 witnesses named on Edwin's dissolution was a man called Elias Morcant, listed as an acting trustee in February 1848. The register showed Elias Morcant had been buried 4 months before that date. A low murmur went through the whole hall. The magistrate compared the 2 signatures side by side for a long moment. Mr. Harcourt, do you still maintain this document is genuine? I found it among my father's papers. Julian stood up. No, he said. You didn't. Edwin turned on him. Sit down. Julian didn't sit down. I was there when Father's map cabinet was opened after the funeral. There was no dissolution in it. You brought that parchment back from London 6 days ago and asked me to swear it had come out of that cabinet. I told you no. I hadn't needed his testimony by that point. The impossible date, the missing registry entry, and a dead witness had already finished the job, but it landed harder than any of the physical evidence had because it came from someone who'd once laughed with everyone else at that will reading and had finally decided to stop. The magistrate ordered the constable to take the forged dissolution into custody. Then he read Dane's written statement aloud in full. Carrick's payment had gone directly to Edwin, personally. Although the granite in question sat entirely inside trust land, and the agreement had promised him a private share of every future royalty besides. His motive now sat right beside his forgery, in plain view of the whole room. Ruth testified that Edwin had come looking for my mother's notebook before the copper plate ever went missing. Caleb testified to finding him alone with that same plate, minutes after we'd pulled Matthew out of the collapse. Edwin denied taking it outright. The magistrate looked to Julian one more time. There were 8 other copper plates in Father's locked cabinet, Julian said quietly. The morning after the blast, Edwin brought a 9th one home and locked it in with the rest. He moved all 9 again before the parish officer sealed the cottage. Where are they now? In the strong room at Harcourt House. The magistrate issued an order protecting all trust property, suspending the auction entirely, and forbidding any further work on the quarry. He referred the forged dissolution for criminal prosecution and sent constables that same afternoon to recover the plates. Edwin had gone the color of old paper. You'd hand your own family's land over to fishermen? He asked me, once the hall had mostly emptied. It was never ours to hand over. You'll gain nothing from this. My mother's work will carry her name, I said. The reef will be charted where it actually sits. No family in this village loses another boat because keeping our estate looking respectable mattered more than telling the truth. I'd call that gaining quite a lot. Nobody in that hall laughed. The 9 plates came back to Blackthorn Head under constable escort a week later, my mother's name still cut into every one of them under thin removable overlays my father had fixed above her original work before ever sending it to print. I peeled each overlay off myself, with witnesses standing over my shoulder. The reef moved back to where it had always actually been. So did the boundary of the Blackthorn Mariners' Trust. It took 4 more months for the law to catch up with the truth. The court confirmed the 1,816 conveyance, voided Edwin's deal with Carrick, and ordered new trustees appointed. Ruth became one of them. Caleb was elected by the fishing families themselves. Between them, they named me the trust's resident cartographer, with permanent use of the cottage and a small yearly wage that was, for the first time in my life, entirely my own. Edwin was convicted of presenting a forged conveyance. Julian took over what remained of the estate, brought my mother's instrument case to the cottage himself that winter, and spent the following week helping inventory every map the trust had ever produced. I didn't forgive him because he carried a few boxes. I gave him the chance to be different, and judged him by what he did with it. By late spring, the title passage stood clear for the first time in decades. My mother's corrected chart went out under 2 names. Original survey by Eliza Harcourt. Corrected and completed by Eliza Harcourt. The first boat came home through the restored passage on a foggy April morning, following my bearing past the reef, guided by a warning lamp we'd finally gotten burning again. I watched it glide in from the same window my mother had cut her sighting grooves into, 25 years before anyone thought to ask what she'd really been doing out there. I opened a clean field book on what used to be her drafting table, and drew the last line of the finished harbor chart in solid black ink. At the bottom, under a coastline we'd both spent our lives correcting, I signed my own name. Outside, the refuge bell rang as another boat came in home, safe, on a coastline that had finally been given back its true shape.